What if your worst nightmare suddenly became real? In the frozen Alaskan wilderness, a 10-year-old girl and her German Shepherd are about to show you what true courage looks like. This isn't just another story. It's Olivia and Hunter's fight for survival against unimaginable cruelty. Hit subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay for every second of this incredible journey that's changing lives worldwide. The isolation of the Alaskan wilderness stretched for miles beyond the dilapidated cabin that 10-year-old Olivia reluctantly called home. Nestled between towering pines that groaned under the weight of winter snow, the cabin sat like a festering wound in the otherwise pristine landscape of the Kenai Peninsula. Inside those rough-hewn walls, time moved differently, marked not by hours or days, but by the unpredictable mood swings of Earl Donnelly, the man Olivia had been forced to call grandfather since she was 3. The cabin's interior rarely saw sunlight, with windows perpetually covered by thick curtains. A persistent smell of whiskey, unwashed dishes, and cigarette smoke hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The floorboards creaked under the heavy footsteps of Earl, a sound that had become a warning system for Olivia, alerting her to seek refuge in the tiny crawlspace beneath the staircase. Earl was a mountain of a man, 6'3" with hands like bear paws, calloused from years of illegal logging and poaching. His face, weathered by the harsh Alaskan elements and decades of alcohol abuse, seemed permanently fixed in a scowl beneath a tangled gray beard. The locals in the nearest town, some 40 miles away, knew to keep their distance. Those few who'd interacted with him at the general store spread whispers about his violent temper and mysterious past. "Get over here, girl." Earl's voice thundered through the cabin one frigid January morning. "What did I tell you about leaving your boots by the door?" Olivia, small for her age with mousy brown hair that hung in uneven chunks from Earl's sporadic cutting, kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "Sorry, sir. I forgot." The back of Earl's hand connected with her cheek before she could move, sending her sprawling across the worn linoleum. "Sorry, don't keep the snow from melting all over my goddamn floor." Thin and pale as parchment, Olivia's skin bore a constellation of bruises in various stages of healing. Yellowing marks on her arms, fresh purple blotches on her ribs, a perpetual ring of finger-shaped marks around her wrists. School was a foreign concept to her. Earl had registered her for homeschooling years ago, though no education took place beyond teaching her to cook his meals and clean his messes. "I won't forget again," she whispered, tasting blood where her tooth had cut the inside of her lip. "Damn right you won't," Earl muttered, already reaching for his morning bottle. "Now get breakfast going. Those traps ain't gonna check themselves." On rare occasions when Earl passed out early, Olivia would sneak to the cabin's single bookshelf, where a handful of tattered paperbacks provided her only glimpse of the outside world. By the light of a stolen flashlight, she'd taught herself to read from old westerns and outdated almanacs, imagining lives beyond the suffocating confines of her prison. At night, curled on her thin mattress in the uninsulated attic, she'd whisper her most precious secret to the frozen window. "Someday, I'll run and never stop." But where would she go? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the few times she'd attempted to flee, Earl had tracked her down with terrifying efficiency. The wilderness that could offer escape was equally capable of claiming her life with its sub-zero temperatures and predators far less predictable than Earl. Outside, watching the cabin with vigilant eyes, a German shepherd named Hunter lay in the snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Unlike Olivia, he wasn't chained, yet he never strayed far. Something in those intelligent eyes suggested he was waiting, patient, observant, and far more aware of the situation than an animal should be. When Olivia appeared at the window, their eyes would meet in silent understanding. They were both prisoners here, bound by different chains but united in their endurance. Hunter had come to the cabin as a trembling 8-week-old pup, the runt of a litter being given away at the Soldotna trading post. Earl had taken him on a whim, mumbling something about needing a guard dog, though his real intention had been to use the puppy as another tool of control over Olivia. "You keep this mutt alive," Earl had growled, tossing the frightened puppy at the 7-year-old girl. "He dies, you get worse than he does." What Earl hadn't anticipated was the unbreakable bond that would form between the child and the dog. Now 3 years old, Hunter had grown into a magnificent specimen, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligent devotion with a thick black and tan coat that helped him endure the brutal Alaskan winters. Though forced to live outside the cabin, Hunter had carved out a den beneath the sagging porch, lining it with pine needles and the occasional blanket Olivia managed to smuggle out to him. From this vantage point, he maintained a constant vigil. His amber eyes tracked Earl's every move when the man was outside, and his ears remained perpetually tuned to the sounds from within the cabin. He had learned to distinguish between normal household noises and the ones that preceded violence. The specific cadence of Earl's angry footsteps, the rising pitch of his voice, the sound of a belt being yanked from its loops. "I wish I could let you inside," Olivia whispered one evening, kneeling beside Hunter's den during a rare moment when Earl had passed out early. Her breath formed crystals in the sub-zero air as she stroked the dog's thick fur. "He'd kill us both if I tried." Hunter's response was to press his muzzle gently against the fading bruise on her forearm, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something uncanny about his gaze, an awareness that transcended typical animal intelligence, as though he understood not just her words but the desperate circumstances they shared. The dog had developed a sixth sense about Earl's moods. On particularly dangerous days, when the alcohol flowed freely and Earl's temper simmered just below the surface, Hunter would position himself closer to the cabin's door. He'd remain utterly still except for the occasional twitch of his ears, conserving energy, waiting with preternatural patience. Olivia had noticed this behavior and had come to rely on it. "Is it safe?" she would whisper through a crack in the door before venturing out to complete her outdoor chores. If Hunter remained in his alert position, she knew to move with extra caution, to speak even more softly, to make herself as invisible as possible within Earl's field of vision. The few people who occasionally visited the remote cabin, mostly buyers of Earl's illegal game meat or unlicensed firearms, commented on the unusually disciplined dog. "That's one serious animal you got there," they'd say, unnerved by Hunter's unwavering stare. "Just a dumb mutt," Earl would reply, though he too seemed wary of the dog's intense focus. He'd taken to carrying his shotgun when crossing the yard after dark. What none of them understood was that Hunter was more than a pet or a guardian. He was Olivia's only ally in a war of attrition. When she cried silently in the woodshed after particularly brutal punishments, he would somehow find his way to her, placing his warm body between her and the door. When food was withheld as punishment, she would often find a freshly killed rabbit or squirrel left precisely where Earl wouldn't see, but she would. Most crucially, Hunter had become her reason to endure. "We'll leave together," she promised him during their stolen moments of connection. "Just a little longer, and we'll find a way." The dog would tilt his head slightly at these words, his eyes reflecting a promise of his own, one that required no words. Until then, he remained her silent sentinel, waiting for the inevitable moment when watching would no longer be enough. Retry March in Alaska brought the false promise of spring, occasional days of brilliant sunshine that melted the surface snow, creating a deceptive crust that refroze into treacherous ice each night. It was during one of these transition periods, when daylight stretched marginally longer but temperatures still plummeted after sunset, that Earl returned from a 3-day drinking binge in town. The headlights of his rusted Ford F-150 cut through the early evening darkness, sweeping across the cabin before jerking to a stop. The truck's engine died with a sputtering cough, followed by the ominous slam of the driver's door. Through the cabin window, Olivia watched Earl stumble up the path, his gait more unsteady than usual. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating his face, contorted with a rage she recognized all too well. "He lost at poker again," she whispered to herself, instinctively moving toward the crawlspace. But she was too late. The door crashed open, admitting a blast of frigid air along with Earl's imposing figure. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the mounting storm, raindrops glistening in his tangled beard. His bloodshot eyes scanned the room before locking onto Olivia. "You," he slurred, pointing a trembling finger. "You're the reason for all this. Every goddamn thing that's gone wrong." Thunder rolled across the sky as Earl stumbled forward, knocking over a chair. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, nature's fury matching the storm brewing inside the cabin. "I didn't do anything," Olivia said, her voice barely audible as she backed toward the kitchen area. I kept everything clean like you said. Earl's laugh was hollow and menacing. Clean? You think that matters? He moved closer, the stench of whiskey and stale cigarettes overwhelming. 16 years I've been stuck out here because of you. Because of what your mother did. Confusion flickered across Olivia's face. Her mother was a hazy concept, a ghost story without form. Earl rarely mentioned her, and never this directly. What are you talking about? The question escaped before she could stop herself. The blow came so quickly she didn't see it, just felt the explosion of pain as his fist connected with her temple. She stumbled backward, colliding with the kitchen table. Don't you dare question me, Earl roared, advancing as lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white flashes. Your mother thought she could run too, thought she could take you away from me. Had to teach her a lesson. Fear and realization dawned simultaneously as Earl reached for the half-empty whiskey bottle on the counter. With one violent motion, he smashed it against the edge of the stove, leaving a jagged weapon in his hand. Maybe you need the same lesson, he growled, glass shards catching the light from the single overhead bulb. Olivia scrambled backward until her spine pressed against the rough wooden wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. Rain pounded against the roof like 1,000 desperate fists as Earl moved forward, bottle raised. Please, she begged, raising her hands in futile defense. I'll be good. I promise. Earl's face twisted into something barely human. Too late for promises, girl. As he lunged forward, Olivia closed her eyes, bracing for pain. Instead, a different sound cut through the storm's chaos. A deep, primordial growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a sound so laden with fury and intent that even Earl froze mid-motion. Both human figures turned toward the still-open door, where the silhouette of Hunter stood rigid, hackles raised along his spine. Rain dripped from his fur, but he paid it no mind. His focus was singular, unwavering, fixed on the jagged bottle in Earl's hand and the cornered child behind him. The growl came again, lower this time, a sound not just of warning but of promise. Lightning flashed once more, reflecting in Hunter's eyes with an almost supernatural glow. In that frozen moment, as thunder shook the cabin's foundation, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power that had defined Olivia's existence. The night of terror had only just begun. The transformation was instantaneous. Hunter, always controlled and calculating, became a blur of primal fury. He launched across the cabin floor with explosive power, covering the distance to Earl in less than a second. His teeth flashed in the dim light as he leapt, a snarl tearing from deep in his chest that sounded nothing like the domesticated animal he had appeared to be. Earl barely had time to turn before 90 pounds of muscle and determination slammed into his chest. The impact sent him crashing backward, the makeshift glass weapon flying from his grasp and shattering against the wall. Hunter's momentum carried them both to the floor, where Earl landed with a heavy thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. What the? Earl's curse was cut short as Hunter's jaws clamped around his forearm with crushing force. The dog's teeth sank through the threadbare flannel shirt and into flesh, triggering a howl of pain that echoed through the cabin. Blood blossomed around Hunter's muzzle as he maintained his grip, growling with each attempt Earl made to dislodge him. Get him off, Earl screamed, his free hand flailing for anything to use as a weapon. Call him off now, girl. Olivia remained frozen against the wall, watching the scene unfold with disbelief. Hunter, always her silent protector, had transformed into something else entirely, an avenging force of nature. His normally gentle eyes had gone dark with purpose, his body tensed with the single-minded objective of neutralizing the threat to his human. Earl managed to grab a cast-iron skillet from the stove with his free hand, swinging it wildly at Hunter's head. The dog seemed to anticipate the move, releasing his grip on Earl's arm only to lunge for his throat in the split second of vulnerability. No, Hunter, don't kill him. Olivia cried out, suddenly afraid of what would happen to her loyal companion if he went too far. The dog hesitated for a fraction of a second at her voice, long enough for Earl to scramble back, leaving a smear of blood across the floor as he retreated toward the shotgun leaning against the wall by the door. Hunter positioned himself between Olivia and Earl, his stance wide and stable, teeth bared in a warning that required no translation. Blood dripped from his muzzle onto the floor, mixing with the rainwater that continued to blow in through the open door. "I'll shoot this damn mutt," Earl threatened, his voice shaking as he struggled to reach the gun while cradling his mangled arm. "Then I'll deal with you." For the first time in her life, Olivia saw naked fear in Earl's eyes, the same fear he had inflicted on her countless times. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air sweeping through the cabin. The realization dawned on her that her grandfather, so monstrous in her world for so long, was just a man, vulnerable, mortal, and now thoroughly terrified. "You won't touch that gun," Olivia said, her voice finding a strength she never knew existed. She stepped beside Hunter, one hand resting on his tense shoulder. "You won't hurt either of us ever again." Earl's eyes darted between them, calculation replacing some of the fear. "You think this changes anything? That mutt can't stay awake forever. And when he sleeps..." He let the threat hang in the air. Hunter moved forward, his growl deepening to something that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Earl flinched, instinctively pressing himself against the wall. "Stay back," he shouted, his bravado crumbling as Hunter advanced another step. "I'm warning you." In that moment, with the storm raging outside and blood pooling on the floor, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Earl, the towering figure who had dominated Olivia's existence with terror, now cowered before the righteous fury of her silent guardian. Blood continued to stream from Earl's arm, his face growing paler by the second. "I need a doctor," he mumbled, the fight beginning to leave him as shock set in. Olivia looked at Hunter, then at the man who had tormented her for years, and made a decision that would change everything. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of the storm, as if the very structure was responding to the shifting power within its walls. Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs as she surveyed the scene before her. Earl slumped against the wall, his blood staining the floorboards. Hunter standing vigilant, muscles coiled and ready to strike again if necessary. "I need help," Earl repeated, his voice weaker now, the sleeve of his flannel shirt saturated with crimson. "You gotta call someone." Olivia almost laughed at the absurdity. "Call who? With what phone?" Her voice was unervingly steady. "You made sure we were cut off from everyone." She took a tentative step toward the kitchen, never turning her back on Earl. Hunter matched her movements, maintaining his protective position between them. On the counter lay Earl's keys, his wallet, and the hunting knife he always carried. Beyond them, mounted on the wall, was the gun cabinet containing his prized possession, a Remington 870 shotgun. "You're just gonna let me bleed out?" Earl's anger was returning as the initial shock subsided. "After all I've done for you? Took you in when nobody wanted you. Put a roof over your head. Stop." Olivia cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Don't pretend you did me any favors." Rain lashed against the windows as she reached for the cabinet key that hung on a nail beside the door. With trembling fingers, she unlocked it and wrapped her hand around the cold steel of the shotgun. It was heavier than she expected, but not unfamiliar. Earl had forced her to clean it weekly since she was 8. "What are you doing?" Fear crept back into Earl's voice as she checked that the gun was loaded, just as he had taught her. "Put that down before you hurt yourself." "I know how to use it," she replied, her finger hovering near, but not on, the trigger. "You made sure of that." Earl's expression morphed from fear to calculation. "Think about what you're doing, girl. You shoot me, that's murder. They'll lock you up and put that dog down. Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Olivia's mind raced through the possibilities. She could end Earl's threat permanently with a single action, ensure he would never hurt her again. Her finger inched closer to the trigger as years of accumulated pain and rage threatened to overcome her reason. Hunter whined softly, breaking her trance. The dog's eyes, now returned to their normal intelligence, studied her with an emotion that seemed almost like concern. "I'm not like you," she finally said, lowering the barrel slightly. "I won't become you." "Smart girl," Earl said, a hint of his old menace returning. "Now put that down and help me stop this bleeding." Olivia shook her head, keeping the shotgun trained in his general direction. "No, this ends tonight. I'm leaving this place, and you're not stopping me." She began moving backward toward the door, her mind racing through what she would need. Food, warm clothes, the emergency cash Earl kept hidden in the coffee can. But where would she go? How far could she get in the storm before Earl recovered enough to come after her? "You won't last a night out there." Earl sneered, sensing her uncertainty. Temperatures dropping below freezing, bears coming out of hibernation hungry. You'll be crawling back by morning, if you survive. The terrible truth of his words seeped into her bones. The wilderness that imprisoned her here would be just as deadly as an escape route. And even if she made it to the highway, what then? She had no identification, no proof of who she was. Earl had made sure of that. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy in her hands as the magnitude of her situation pressed down on her. Freedom was a concept as foreign to her as school or friends or safety, something she could imagine but couldn't quite grasp how to achieve. "I'll give you one chance," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Tell me where my birth certificate is, where any proof of who I am is hidden. Give me enough money to get far away from here. Do that, and maybe I won't have to make a different choice." Earl's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You think I kept that stuff? There's nothing. No record of you. Far as the world's concerned, you don't exist." The hopelessness of her situation crashed over Olivia like a physical wave, threatening to drown her resolve. The shotgun dipped in her grasp as tears blurred her vision. Then, through the howling wind, came a sound that didn't belong to the storm, the distant but unmistakable wail of sirens, growing steadily closer. The first flash of red and blue lights painted the cabin walls like an abstract nightmare, casting strange shadows that danced across Olivia's face. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway cut through the storm's chaos. Hunter's ears perked up, his head tilting toward the door as the sirens wailed to silence. "Who did you call?" Earl hissed, his face contorting with rage and disbelief. "There's no way. I didn't call anyone," Olivia whispered, equally stunned by this turn of events. The shotgun suddenly felt like a damning piece of evidence in her hands. She quickly placed it on the kitchen table, her mind racing. Car doors slammed outside. Flashlight beams swept across the windows, catching dust particles in their harsh glow. A commanding voice pierced the night. "Alaska State Troopers. Anyone inside, make yourselves known." Earl's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "You say nothing," he growled, leveraging himself up against the wall despite his injury. "You hear me? Nothing about what happened here." Hunter issued a low warning growl as Earl attempted to stand taller, to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Blood continued to seep from his arm, forming a small puddle at his feet. Heavy footsteps approached the front door, followed by 3 sharp knocks that seemed to reverberate through Olivia's bones. "Police, open up." Time stretched like taffy as Olivia stood frozen between her past and what might be her future. Then, with a deep breath that felt like her first in years, she moved toward the door. "Don't you dare," Earl threatened, his voice dropping to that familiar tone that had controlled her for so long. She hesitated for just a moment, years of conditioning battling against the hope that had suddenly appeared like a lifeline. Hunter pressed against her leg, a warm, solid reminder that she wasn't alone. With trembling fingers, she reached for the doorknob. The door swung open to reveal 2 Alaska State Troopers, their imposing figures silhouetted against the storm. Rain pelted their wide-brimmed hats and slickers as they took in the scene before them. The blood-spattered floor, the girl with bruises visible on her face, the large German shepherd standing protectively at her side, and the injured man slumped against the far wall. "Jesus Christ," the older trooper muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the holster at his hip. His nameplate read Mitchell. "Everyone stay where you are." The younger officer stepped forward, his eyes kind but assessing as he crouched to Olivia's level. "Are you all right, miss? Are you hurt?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than accusation, nearly broke her. When was the last time anyone had asked about her welfare? I'm okay," she managed, her voice barely audible. "But my grandfather needs a doctor." Hunter bit him. "Hunter?" the trooper questioned. Olivia gestured to the dog, who remained vigilant but had stopped growling. "He was protecting me." The older trooper, Mitchell, approached Earl, already pulling out a first aid kit from his belt. "Sir, I need you to keep still while I examine that wound." Earl's face had gone pale, but his eyes burned with fury. "That damn dog attacked me for no reason. It's dangerous, needs to be put down." "That's not true," Olivia blurted out, panic rising in her throat. "He only bit because what, honey?" the younger trooper asked gently. The moment hung suspended in time. a crossroads where one path led back to silence and suffering, the other toward an unknown future that somehow couldn't be worse than her past. Because my grandfather was going to hurt me. With a broken bottle. The words tumbled out, each one making the next easier. He hits me all the time. Has for years. Earl lunged forward despite his injury. She's lying. Kids make up stories, sir. Stay back. Mitchell ordered sharply, physically positioning himself between Earl and Olivia. The cabin suddenly seemed to shrink with the addition of these outsiders, these witnesses to the private hell that had been Olivia's entire world. The younger trooper was speaking into his radio, requesting medical assistance and a social worker. Words like suspected abuse and emergency placement floated through the air. How did you find us? Olivia asked, still unable to believe this wasn't some cruel dream from which she'd awaken. Mitchell secured a pressure bandage around Earl's arm as he answered. Got a call from Bill Hensley. Runs the lumber operation about 10 miles south. Said he was driving home and heard what sounded like a murder happening coming from this direction. Decided to check it out. Nosy bastard should mind his own business. Earl spat, wincing as the bandage tightened. Mitchell's eyes hardened. Sir, I strongly suggest you remain silent until we sort this out. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. An ambulance, its lights cutting swirls through the rain, and another patrol car. The isolated cabin that had been Olivia's prison for so long was suddenly the center of attention. As Earl was escorted to the ambulance, handcuffed despite his protests about his injury, Olivia felt Hunter press against her side. She buried her fingers in his thick fur, anchoring herself to this moment, to this unexpected chance at freedom. What happens now? She asked the younger trooper, who had draped a blanket around her shoulders. Now, he said with gentle certainty, we make sure you're safe. Both of you. He nodded toward Hunter with a small smile. That's a good dog you've got there. Olivia looked down at Hunter, her guardian, her savior, her first and only friend. Yes, she whispered. The best. The Kenai County Courthouse stood like a fortress of justice against the crisp autumn sky, its red brick exterior and imposing columns representing a world of rules and consequences entirely foreign to Olivia. 3 months had passed since that stormy night when her life had changed forever. Now, dressed in clothes that still felt strangely new, a simple navy blue dress and cardigan provided by her foster family, she sat rigid on the wooden bench outside Courtroom B, Hunter lying at her feet with special permission from the judge. Remember, you don't have to look at him if you don't want to, said Ms. Reynolds, the victim advocate who had been assigned to Olivia's case. Just look at me or the prosecutor when you're answering questions. Olivia nodded, her fingers absently stroking Hunter's fur. The dog had been officially classified as a service animal to allow him to remain with her, a classification that wasn't entirely untrue, given the nightmares that still plagued her sleep. Inside the courtroom, with its high ceilings and polished wooden fixtures, Olivia felt like an imposter, a creature of shadow suddenly thrust into harsh light. The gallery was filled with unfamiliar faces, reporters from local papers, social workers, curious townspeople, and, most surprisingly, neighbors and community members she'd never met, but who had lived within miles of her prison for years. All rise for the Honorable Judge Sarah Connolly, the bailiff announced. The proceedings began with a formality that seemed at odds with the raw, ugly truth they were meant to address. Earl sat at the defense table, almost unrecognizable in a borrowed suit that hung loose on his frame after months in county lockup. He kept his eyes forward, never turning to acknowledge Olivia's presence. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Delacourt, approached the podium. Your Honor, the state will prove that the defendant, Earl Donnelly, systematically and brutally abused his grandchild over a period of approximately 7 years. The evidence will show that he kept this child in isolation, denied her education, medical care, and the most basic human dignities, while inflicting physical and psychological torture that can only be described as monstrous. As Ms. Delacourt outlined the charges, aggravated child abuse, false imprisonment, assault with a deadly weapon, and a host of others, Olivia felt a strange detachment, as if the child being described was someone else entirely. The most difficult testimony came from the medical examiner, Dr. Chun, who clinically described the evidence of long-term abuse found during Olivia's examination. The subject presents with 27 distinct scars consistent with cigarette burns, primarily on the upper back and shoulders. Multiple healed fractures in various stages indicate repeated injuries over several years, none of which received proper medical treatment. Photographs were submitted as evidence. Clinical, stark images of Olivia's injuries that caused several jurors to visibly flinch. One older woman on the jury openly wiped tears from her eyes. Then came the neighbors, people who had lived within a 10-mile radius of the cabin but had rarely, if ever, interacted directly with Olivia. "I seen her maybe 3 times in all those years," testified Jim Curver, a trapper who owned property adjoining Earl's land. "Always from a distance. Asked Earl once if the girl went to school. He said he homeschooled her, and I didn't press it. Wasn't my business." He paused, shame evident in his weathered face. Should have been everyone's business. Linda Moskowitz, who ran the general store in the nearest town, recalled Earl's monthly visits for supplies. Sometimes he'd buy children's clothes, girls' stuff. Once I asked if his granddaughter might like a book I was getting rid of, just a children's novel. He said reading gave her ideas above her station. I thought it was odd, but her voice trailed off. We all knew something wasn't right. We just didn't want to know how bad it really was. When it was finally Olivia's turn to testify, she approached the witness stand with Hunter padding silently beside her, his presence the only thing keeping her knees from buckling. The oath to tell the truth felt unnecessary. Truth was all she had left. "Olivia," Ms. Delacourt began gently. "Can you tell the court how long you've lived with the defendant?" "Since I was 3, she replied, her voice small but clear. "After my mother died. At least, that's what he told me." "And during that time, did your grandfather ever hurt you physically?" Olivia's eyes flickered to Earl for just a moment. His face remained impassive, but something in his eyes, a familiar warning, made her stomach clench. "Yes," she said, returning her gaze to Ms. Delacourt. "Almost every day." Over the next hour, Olivia recounted a childhood that drew gasps and murmurs from the gallery, describing isolation so complete that she couldn't name the current president, punishments so severe she had learned to dislocate her own shoulder to reduce the pain, and a level of neglect that had left her with the education level of a 3rd grader despite being 10 years old. During cross-examination, Earl's court-appointed attorney tried to suggest that Olivia was exaggerating, that her injuries could have been from normal childhood accidents in a rugged environment. "Isn't it possible that your grandfather was simply strict, rather than abusive?" Hunter growled softly at the suggestion, earning a sharp look from Judge Connolly. "He locked me in a root cellar for 3 days because I dropped an egg," Olivia responded, her voice suddenly stronger. "I still have the marks where rats bit me while I was down there. Is that just being strict?" The defense attorney had no follow-up questions. When the verdict came after just 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts, Olivia felt nothing but a hollow sort of vindication. The sentence, when pronounced a week later, was 30 years without possibility of parole. "You stole this child's life," Judge Connolly said during sentencing, her voice hard as steel. "Society now takes yours in return." As Earl was led away in handcuffs, he turned for the first time to look directly at Olivia. "This isn't over," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. "Not by a long shot." The deputy yanked him forward, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp yet impossible to ignore. The Jacobsons' home sat on 2 acres of well-tended land just outside Anchorage, a world away from the isolated cabin where Olivia had spent most of her life. With its bright yellow siding and white trim, vegetable garden, and tire swing hanging from a sturdy oak, it represented everything normal and secure that she had been denied. For the past 3 months, Mark and Karen Jacobson had provided Olivia with her first experience of what a real family might be like. "Olivia, honey, breakfast is ready," Karen called up the stairs, her voice warm and patient. Unlike Earl's commands, Karen's words carried no undercurrent of threat, no expectation of immediate, perfect obedience. At the kitchen table, Olivia picked at her scrambled eggs while Hunter sat vigilant at her side. Though the nightmares had decreased in frequency, they remained vivid enough that she still woke most nights in cold sweat, reaching instinctively for her canine protector. Mark lowered his newspaper, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Big day today, kiddo. First official day of school assessment. Nervous?" Olivia shrugged, still uncomfortable with direct questions about her feelings. Maybe a little. The truth was that nervous didn't begin to cover the swirling anxiety about entering a classroom for the first time. The social worker had arranged for educational testing to determine appropriate placement, with the goal of integrating her into the local middle school once she was ready. The doorbell interrupted the moment. Karen glanced at her watch with a frown. That's early for Dr. Whitman. Instead of the expected educational consultant, Sheriff Mitchell stood on the front porch, his expression grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Hunter immediately tensed, sensing the change in atmosphere. Mrs. Jacobson, the sheriff nodded politely before his eyes found Olivia. Morning, Olivia. Sorry to disturb your breakfast, but I need to speak with your foster parents. In private, if possible. Karen guided Olivia to the living room with the promise of returning shortly. Hunter followed, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors as he maintained his protective vigil. Through the partially closed kitchen door, Olivia could hear the low murmur of adult voices trying to keep terrible news contained. Escaped, 2 guards injured. Not sure how he got transportation. Hunter's ears perked up at the same moment. Olivia's blood ran cold. There was only one he. That would bring Sheriff Mitchell to their door. When the adults re-entered the living room, their forced smiles confirmed her fears before they spoke a word. Olivia, Karen began, sitting beside her on the sofa. There's been an incident. Earl escaped. Olivia interrupted flatly. It wasn't a question. He's coming for me, isn't he? Sheriff Mitchell knelt to her eye level, not bothering with the gentle language adults typically use to shield children from harsh realities. He had seen firsthand what this particular child had already endured. We believe that's his intention. Yes, he confirmed. He managed to overpower a guard during transport to the medical facility and stole a corrections vehicle. We've got every available officer looking for him, roadblocks on all major highways, and alerts at airports and bus stations. It won't matter, Olivia said, her voice distant. He knows how to move through the woods, how to stay off roads. He used to brag about it. The living room with its comfortable furniture and family photos suddenly felt as exposed as a glass box. Earl would find her. That wasn't in question. The only uncertainty was when. We're placing a deputy outside your house 24/7, Sheriff Mitchell continued. And I've spoken with your school. All visits are postponed until we have him back in custody. Mark placed a protective hand on Olivia's shoulder. We could go stay with my sister in Seattle for a while. Get completely out of state. Sheriff Mitchell shook his head grimly. Preliminary investigation suggests he's made some connections in prison. Dangerous ones. He had help with this escape, which means he may have resources we don't know about. Best to keep Olivia where we can ensure maximum protection. Karen's voice cracked with barely controlled fear. How could this happen? The trial was national news. Everyone knows what he did to her. That's exactly why he had leverage, Mitchell explained. Some of the other inmates saw him as someone who stood up to the system. He apparently traded protection inside for help getting out. He focused on Olivia again. Did he ever talk about anyone he knew? Any friends or contacts who might help him? Olivia shook her head. He didn't have friends, just people he did business with. What kind of business? She hesitated, remembering overheard conversations late at night. Men with hard voices discussing shipments and drop points. Exchanges of cash for items never named directly. I think he sold guns sometimes. And other things. People would come to the cabin after dark. Sheriff Mitchell exchanged a meaningful look with the Jacobsons. Weapons trafficking. That would explain some of his connections. As the adults continued discussing security protocols, Olivia felt a strange calm settling over her. The monster from her nightmares had returned to the waking world, but something fundamental had changed. She was no longer alone and powerless. Her hand found Hunter's fur, fingers tangling in the thick ruff around his neck. The dog looked up at her with those intelligent eyes that had always understood more than an animal should. We've faced him before, she whispered, too quietly for the adults to hear. And this time, I'm not a helpless little girl anymore. Later that night, after the security systems had been double-checked and the deputy stationed outside had made his first perimeter check, Olivia sat cross-legged on her bed with Hunter beside her. From beneath her mattress, she withdrew the small notebook Karen had given her for processing feelings, as her therapist suggested. Instead of emotional reflections, the pages contained meticulously drawn maps of the surrounding area, notes on the daily routines of the neighborhood, and observations of potential weaknesses in the security arrangements. In the margin of one page, a single sentence was written in careful script. "He won't take me by surprise this time." Outside, the northern lights shimmered across the sky, beautiful, ancient, and indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Somewhere in that vast Alaskan wilderness, Earl Donnelly was moving closer, drawn by vengeance and the twisted belief that Olivia was somehow his property to reclaim. But waiting for him was no longer a helpless child. In her place stood a survivor who had already endured the worst he could inflict and lived to see him face justice once before. The cabin stood as it always had, a dark blemish on the landscape, weathered and foreboding against the backdrop of endless pine. 3 weeks had passed since Earl's escape, each day stretching Olivia's nerves thinner as the authorities found nothing but false leads and cold trails. The decision to use the abandoned cabin as bait had not come easily to Sheriff Mitchell, but after extensive planning and Olivia's unwavering insistence, he had reluctantly agreed. "I still don't like this," he muttered, adjusting the bulletproof vest beneath his jacket for the third time in an hour. From their concealed position in the dense underbrush 50 yards from the cabin's front door, they had a clear view of the approach. "Using a child as bait goes against everything I stand for." "I'm not bait," Olivia corrected, her voice steady. "I'm the one thing he wants more than freedom. The one thing that will make him careless." The sheriff glanced at her, concern etched in the lines around his eyes. In the 3 days they had been setting up this operation, he had watched this child transform, her posture straighter, her eyes constantly scanning, her voice taking on a hardness that no 11-year-old should possess. The responsibilities of adulthood had been forced upon her long before Earl's escape. "Remember the rules," Mitchell said firmly. "You stay inside with Deputy Phillips at all times. Hunter stays with you. At the first sign of Earl, you go straight to the safe room we prepared. No heroics." Olivia nodded, though something in her expression suggested she had plans of her own. Hunter sat beside her, unusually still, his attention fixed on the cabin as if he understood exactly what, or who, they were waiting for. The setup was meticulous. 6 deputies strategically positioned around the perimeter, silent alarms on every possible entrance. The cabin's interior staged to appear as if Olivia had fled there looking for familiar surroundings. Childhood drawings recovered from evidence still tacked to the refrigerator, her few possessions scattered convincingly around the small bedroom. The local news had reported that Olivia had disappeared from her foster home, with authorities pursuing all leads. It was a calculated risk, but one that law enforcement believed would draw Earl out of hiding. His obsession with controlling Olivia had been evident in every page of his prison correspondence, letters never sent, but discovered in his cell after the escape, filled with promises of retribution. As dusk settled over the forest, the temperature dropped sharply. Olivia pulled her jacket tighter, remembering countless nights spent shivering in the attic bedroom because Earl refused to waste heat on an ungrateful mouth to feed. Movement on the North Ridge, crackled the radio at Mitchell's hip, set to the lowest possible volume. Single figure, moving deliberately, approximately half a mile out. Mitchell raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. "Copy that. All units maintain position. No engagement until positive ID and my command." Olivia felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. Hunter tensed beside her, a low rumble beginning deep in his chest. "Time to move inside," Mitchell whispered, guiding her toward the cabin's rear entrance where Deputy Phillips waited. "You know what to do." The cabin's interior was exactly as she remembered, though now devoid of Earl's oppressive presence. The bloodstain from Hunter's attack remained on the floorboards, a dark reminder of the night everything changed. Deputy Phillips, a former military woman with sharp eyes and few words, nodded as they entered. "Everything's set," she confirmed. "Panic button under the table, escape hatch under the rug in the storage closet. Safe room is stocked and secure." Olivia took her position in the small living area, visible through the front window but protected by bullet-resistant glass discreetly installed days earlier. Hunter sat at her feet, his body tense with anticipation. Outside, darkness fell completely, the forest becoming a black void broken only by the faint silver of moonlight filtering through the canopy. Inside, A single lamp cast a warm glow designed to be visible from a distance, a beacon for the predator they sought to trap. Hours passed in tense silence. Midnight came and went. Olivia fought against the heaviness of her eyelids, determined to be alert when Earl finally appeared. The crackle of the radio startled her from a momentary lapse in vigilance. "All units, be advised," came the urgent whisper. "Suspect approaching from the southeast. On foot, armed with what appears to be a hunting knife. ETA to cabin approximately 2 minutes." Phillips motioned for Olivia to move to the safe room, but she hesitated, her eyes fixed on the window. She needed to see him, to confirm with her own eyes that the monster of her nightmares was real and could be defeated. Through the glass, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the trees. Earl moved with the caution of a man who had spent his life in these woods, each step deliberate, testing for dry branches that might betray his presence. He looked thinner than she remembered, his prison-issued clothes exchanged for hunting gear that blended with the forest. But even at a distance, Olivia recognized the predatory intent in his movements, the same stalking approach he had used countless times before inflicting pain. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hunter's growl deepened, his body coiled like a spring. Deputy Phillips drew her weapon, positioning herself between Olivia and the door. "Sheriff Mitchell, we have visual confirmation." Phillips spoke softly into her radio. "Suspect is approaching the front entrance. Awaiting your command." The radio remained silent. Earl paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the cabin with tactical precision. His head tilted slightly, listening, assessing. Before he continued forward, knife gripped in his right hand, something else clutched in his left. "What's he holding?" Phillips murmured, straining to see through the darkness. As Earl drew closer to the pool of light spilling from the window, Olivia felt her blood freeze. In his left hand was a crude leash fashioned from rope, a collar dangling at its end. "He brought that for Hunter," she realized aloud. "He wants to make sure I have nothing left." The symbolism wasn't lost on Phillips, whose expression hardened further. "Safe room. Now." But before either could move, Earl's pace suddenly quickened. He abandoned caution, rushing toward the cabin door with unexpected speed. "He knows it's a trap," Olivia gasped. "Mitchell, he's making his move." Phillips barked into the radio, still receiving no response. "All units converge." The front door burst open with a splintering crack as Earl threw his full weight against it. Hunter launched forward, teeth bared, as Phillips raised her weapon. "Police, freeze," she commanded. Earl's face, illuminated in the cabin's light, contorted with a fury that Olivia remembered all too well. But there was something else there too, a calculating gleam that suggested he wasn't as cornered as he appeared. "You think I came alone?" he snarled, and as if summoned by his words, gunfire erupted from the forest edge. "Officer down," came a frantic voice through the radio. "West perimeter. We need backup." In the split second of Phillips' distraction, Earl lunged. The knife flashed in the lamplight as Hunter intercepted him midair, the two crashing to the floor in a chaotic tangle of limbs and teeth and steel. Olivia didn't scream, didn't freeze. Instead, with a clarity born from years of surviving this man's violence, she moved directly to the fireplace and grabbed the iron poker, the same implement Earl had once used to discipline her for speaking without permission. Outside, the night erupted into chaos as law enforcement engaged with Earl's unexpected accomplices. Inside, a more personal battle raged, one with roots stretching back through years of accumulated pain and fear. Hunter fought with the desperate determination of a guardian who understood exactly what was at stake, his teeth finding purchase in Earl's forearm just as they had months before. But Earl had prepared for this, the thick leather bracer beneath his sleeve blunting the dog's attack. "I learned from last time, Mutt," Earl spat, driving his elbow into Hunter's ribs with a sickening thud. The dog yelped but maintained his grip, buying precious seconds as Phillips recovered her stance and Olivia circled behind her tormentor, poker raised. It was in this frozen tableau, Earl struggling with Hunter, Phillips aiming her weapon but unable to fire with the dog in her line of sight, Olivia poised to strike, that Sheriff Mitchell finally burst through the back entrance, weapon drawn. "Donnelly, it's over," he shouted above the chaos. "Your accomplices are down or surrounded. There's no way out." Earl's eyes, wild with thwarted rage, found Olivia's. In that gaze was everything she had feared for months. The promise that he would never stop, never rest until he had reclaimed what he believed was his to control or destroy. "She'll never be free of me," he growled. "Never." With unexpected strength, he tore his arm from Hunter's jaws and lunged toward Olivia, knife extended. Three things happened simultaneously. Phillips fired, her bullet grazing Earl's shoulder. Hunter launched a second attack, catching Earl's leg, and Olivia swung the poker with all the force her small frame could muster. The iron connected with Earl's temple with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the cabin like a death knell. He crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering harmlessly beside him. In the sudden silence, broken only by Hunter's labored breathing and the distant shouts of officers securing the perimeter, Olivia stood over the unconscious form of her lifelong tormentor. "You're wrong," she whispered, though he couldn't hear. "I'm already free." The Anchorage courtroom stood silent as Judge Harriet Rowan reviewed the documentation before her one final time. 6 months had passed since the night at the cabin. 6 months of healing, of learning, of gradually building a life that wasn't defined by fear. Olivia sat in the front row between Karen and Mark Jacobson, Hunter at her feet, with his service dog vest neatly buckled. The German Shepherd's eyes never left Earl Donnelly, who sat shackled at the defense table, a prison jumpsuit replacing his hunting gear. Earl's second trial had been swift. The attempted murder charges, compounded by the prison escape and the revelation of his connections to an Alaska-based weapons trafficking ring, had left his court-appointed attorney with few options beyond attempting to secure a sentence that wouldn't amount to life imprisonment. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, Judge Rowan began, her voice carrying through the courtroom with serene authority. "This court sentences the defendant, Earl Michael Donnelly, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at the maximum security facility in Seward." A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the gallery. Olivia felt Karen's hand tighten around hers, a silent anchor in the moment that would officially close this chapter of her life. "The defendant will be remanded immediately to the custody of the Alaska Department of Corrections," Judge Rowan continued. "Additionally, a permanent restraining order is granted, prohibiting any form of contact with the victim, including but not limited to letters, phone calls, or communication through third parties." As the judge delivered these final pronouncements, Earl turned slowly in his seat, his eyes finding Olivia's across the courtroom. The malice that had once made her shrink into herself now seemed diminished, not eliminated, but rendered impotent by the walls of justice that would contain him for the remainder of his life. "This court is adjourned," Judge Rowan declared with a decisive rap of her gavel. As the bailiffs moved to escort Earl from the courtroom, he paused, his shackles rattling with the sudden movement. "You think this is over?" he called out, his voice hoarse but still carrying that familiar venom. "You'll never be rid of me, girl. I'm in your head forever." Hunter growled softly, rising to his feet as Sheriff Mitchell stepped between Earl and Olivia's line of sight. "That's enough, Donnelly," Mitchell warned, his hand moving instinctively to his holster. But Olivia stood, gently moving past the sheriff to face her former tormentor one last time. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "You're wrong, Earl," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You don't live in my head anymore. You don't live anywhere that matters." For a moment, something flickered across Earl's weathered face, perhaps the first recognition that the power he had wielded for so long had truly slipped beyond his grasp. Then his features hardened once more into a mask of hatred as the bailiffs firmly guided him toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, spring had arrived in Alaska with its characteristic intensity, the landscape transforming from barren white to vibrant green almost overnight. Olivia stood on the steps, breathing deeply of the fresh air that carried the promise of renewal. "You did good in there, kiddo," Sheriff Mitchell said, joining her with a respectful distance that acknowledged her need for space. "How are you feeling?" Olivia considered the question carefully. In the months since the confrontation at the cabin, she had learned to identify and name her emotions with the help of Dr. Patton, her trauma-focused therapist. "I feel light," she finally answered, "like something heavy has been put down." Mitchell nodded, understanding more than most the weight she had carried. He had been a constant presence throughout the legal proceedings, ensuring that every protective measure was implemented with meticulous care. The Jacobsons mentioned you got your first report card last week, he said, changing the subject with deliberate lightness. How'd that go? A small smile touched Olivia's lips. All A's in science and math. Still working on history and English. The simple normalcy of discussing school achievements felt like a tiny miracle. Karen Jacobson approached, Hunter trotting faithfully beside her. The social worker wants to speak with us briefly about finalizing the adoption paperwork, she said, her voice carrying a barely contained excitement. She says with Earl's sentencing complete, we can accelerate the timeline. The word adoption still felt foreign to Olivia, a concept so removed from her previous reality that she struggled to fully grasp its permanence. The Jacobsons had first broached the subject 3 months ago, presenting it not as charity, but as the natural evolution of the family they had already begun to form. Is that still okay with you? Karen asked gently, recognizing the complex emotions that crossed Olivia's face. Olivia nodded, words momentarily beyond her reach. Hunter pressed against her leg, offering the silent support that had been her lifeline through the darkest moments. As they descended the courthouse steps toward the waiting car, a reporter approached, microphone extended. Olivia, how does it feel knowing Earl Donnelly will spend the rest of his life in prison? Are you still afraid? Before Sheriff Mitchell could intervene, Olivia answered with a composure that belied her 11 years. I'm not afraid anymore. Fear is a cage, and I don't live in cages now. The profound simplicity of her response left the reporter momentarily speechless, giving the small family the opportunity to continue toward their car unimpeded. That evening, the Jacobson home hummed with quiet celebration. A special dinner had been prepared, Olivia's favorite, lasagna with extra cheese, and a small cake decorated with the words, "Our family, official soon," sat on the kitchen counter. Mark had hung a new tire swing in the backyard, higher and sturdier than the previous one, acknowledging Olivia's growth, both physical and emotional. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, Olivia sat on the back porch steps, Hunter resting his head on her lap. Together they watched the northern lights begin their ethereal dance across the darkening sky, the same lights she had once viewed through a grimy attic window as symbols of a freedom that seemed impossibly distant. We made it, she whispered to Hunter, scratching behind his ears exactly the way he preferred. The dog looked up at her with eyes that reflected understanding beyond animal capacity, the shared journey that had forged their bond through fire and fear and, finally, freedom. From inside came the sound of Karen's laughter at something Mark had said, the casual, unguarded joy of a secure home. In 2 weeks, Olivia would start the new school term not as a foster child, but as Olivia Jacobson. The other students knew pieces of her story. It had been impossible to shield her entirely from the publicity of the trials, but they had accepted her with the straightforward inclusion that children sometimes manage better than adults. Hunter's ears suddenly perked up, his head lifting from her lap as he stared intently at the tree-line that bordered the property. Old instincts flared momentarily in Olivia's chest, the habitual vigilance that had kept her alive for so long. But instead of tensing, she took a deep breath and watched as a young moose emerged cautiously from the trees, pausing to graze on the tender spring vegetation at the yard's edge. Hunter remained alert but calm, recognizing the difference between threat and mere presence. It's okay, Olivia told him softly. We're safe here. The words were simple but profound, an affirmation of the new reality they were building day by day. The cabin in the woods existed now only in court documents and fading nightmares. Earl Donnelly's reign of terror had been reduced to case files and prison records. The future stretched before her not as a desperate hope, but as a tangible path. As if sensing the significance of the moment, Hunter pressed his warm body closer to hers. Together, guardian and survivor, they watched the moose continue its peaceful grazing, the northern lights dancing overhead in silent celebration of a freedom hard-won and fiercely protected. A freedom that, at long last, felt truly and permanently their own. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched all the way through," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's going to be super emotional.